There's been a lot of discussion over the past couple of days about that new COVID vaccine. I think they call that bivalent vaccine, which is apparently going to be made available as early as next week. Now, earlier today, Jean-Yves Duclos, our Canadian health minister, made an announcement. Here's part of what he said.
780,000 doses of that new bivalent vaccine will be delivered to Canada tomorrow. A total of 10.5 million doses will be delivered by the end of September. As usual, these vaccines will be delivered quickly and free of charge to provinces and territories.
That includes us. The question is, when does the campaign begin here? I imagine it's going to roll out fairly quickly, but maybe the bigger question, and this is what people seem to be asking, is given that it's going to be available as quickly as it will be, and maybe you've reached that target of 5 or 6 months and thinking of getting another booster, do you wait? Do you take this one? What do you do? Well, Dr. Christopher LABOS is going to try to explain. He's a cardiologist, of course, with a degree in epidemiology. You can hear him, by the way, weekday or Sunday mornings, rather, at 8:10 here on Cjad on Weekends with Ken. So, Dr. LABOS, first of all, thank you for being here. What do you do if you are that person? Now you're hearing, it was one thing to talk about it coming here before the end of the year. Now we're talking about maybe being here by as early as next week.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Most people are going to need a fall booster shot, and this is consistent with NACI's recommendations. The question is going to be, how long has it been since your last dose or since your last infection with COVID? And the real ideal is going to be to wait, at least 6 months, because prior to that, there's not that much benefit to getting an extra booster shot. So it's an interesting situation because a lot of people may have gotten a fourth dose now, like during the summer period, because of the surge of cases that we saw with BA5. So people who got doses in, April or May or even June, probably can afford to wait until the end of the year when we'll have a better idea of what the timeline is going to be. So that's really going to be the first and probably the most important issue, is sort of the timing from your last dose. And the consensus is that 6 months is probably the ideal interval to be waiting in that respect.
Okay, so you wait your 5 or 6 months, then you go for this shot. And obviously the difference, we should explain, I guess, not taking it for granted. The idea of having this new vaccine is, yes, it's going to deal with the original strain of the virus, but it's also, of course, now going to be more effective against these new strains we have. That's the reason you'd want to take it.
Right. The rationale is that by getting two vaccines in one, because that's essentially what this is two vaccines in one, you're getting a broader degree of protection. And this is consistent with how we do the flu vaccine every year. The flu vaccine every year is a trivalent. Actually, now it's become a quadrivalent vaccine, meaning you're getting vaccinated against 3 or 4 different flu strains, because with the flu, there's actually multiple flu strains circulating. So by having multiple strains in the same dose, in the same shot, you're getting a broader degree of protection. And so this is the same sort of rationale here, giving people a broader degree of protection because the virus does change and you do sometimes have multiple variants of COVID circulating. The most dominant one now is BA5, but there's always a combination. There was a little bit of BA4, a little bit of BA1, and some other minor variants circulating as well.
When you talk about the broader degree of protection, it makes me think about the mixing and matching that we talked about early in the vaccination campaign. So, like people who got AstraZeneca, I got AstraZeneca and then got a Pfizer, some got Moderna. Like it was sort of a mishmash of things. Now, how do you feel about Moderna coming back into play? Like if somebody's only had Pfizer, is it a good thing to get a different brand? Is it like, how is that going to work, Dr. LABOS?
The reality is that Pfizer and Moderna are so similar that you can almost look at them as interchangeable. I mean, there's some differences in terms of dose. There's a little bit concern with respect to the higher doses that Moderna used. Was that potentially causing some of the higher side effects that were being seen? But the reality is, in terms of mechanistically, we should almost consider them as interchangeable because they're both mRNA vaccines. So when we were talking about mixing and matching in terms of different types of vaccines, when you went from AstraZeneca, which was a more traditional vaccine type, to an mRNA vaccine, because you're having the different mechanisms, that's where we saw the greatest difference or the greatest benefit. But with Pfizer and Moderna, because they ultimately probably will both get approved in terms of their bivalent vaccines that they've developed, it's probably not going to make much of a difference if you get one over the other. We'll see if the data suggests something else, but up until now, they've been essentially equivalent.
Can I ask where we stand right now with respect to you should have at least X number of doses? Is that number 3 or 4 now?
Well, you sort of need 3 doses to have optimal degree of protection. If you're stuck at 2, you have suboptimal protection, especially against the Omicron variant. But going forward, it's probably not going to be practical to talk about number of doses. We're probably going to be talking about dosing interval, and we're going to have these types of discussions like, has it been 6 months since your last dose? Get a booster. And then we're probably going to be in a more regularized pattern where we're talking about dealing with the surge of cases that we see in the fall and the winter. COVID so far has defied any type of regularity, and that's why the messaging has been a little bit chaotic and a little bit all over the place. But going forward, it's very likely going to be a question of interval since your last dose rather than the cumulative number of doses that you've received.
Can I just ask, you just said an interesting word, it's defied, I guess what we would call normal in life of viruses. What does that mean? How has it done that?
Well, so most respiratory viruses surge during the winter and abate during the summer, right? The flu is the obvious example. Colds are the obvious example. Other stuff like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, you tend to see them in winter months. You know, the flu sort of starts to peak around October, November. It goes up and then starts to disappear as we get into the spring. And initially we thought COVID was going to behave in a similar way, but it hasn't quite. We've seen surges in the summer, and so that's what's made it a little bit difficult to deal with. It doesn't follow the regular pattern. If it falls into a more regular seasonal pattern, it'll be much easier to deal with. We'll get most likely a COVID vaccine in the same way that we get a flu vaccine every year, because you're just going to need it to cover you during the worst periods of months. And that probably is what the ultimate strategy is going to be. But in the short term, and this is still a new pandemic, even though people think it's been going on forever, this is still relatively new. The fact that it's new and the fact that it's been variable is the reason why people have gotten booster shots in the summer and why things have not been regular up until now.
I mean, there's been so many viruses going around again of late. Like, for a while there, we were only hearing of everybody having COVID again. It was like, oh, they got COVID. But then it went to a gastro and a flu and a cold. Like, again, during the summer, I feel like we've seen more of that than we usually do. So what does that tell us? Does it tell us anything?
Well, it tells us a couple of things. We have seen these atypical presentations. I don't know if you remember last summer, there was a very high number of RSV, another type of respiratory virus that was affecting mainly kids, and that was off season. What happened was that we saw very few other viruses for the first beginning of the pandemic because everybody was wearing masks. And so there was no flu. We had no flu in Canada for 2 years. And I say this a lot, but it's worth repeating. COVID was the first time when we did not have a flu season in Canada, which is an incredible thing when you look at it historically. And it's because people were, not gathering in large groups and wearing masks. So the minute that goes away, all these viruses started circulating again. So you're having a bit of a rebound phenomenon. And I think the interesting thing about that is not the, historical aspect to it, because people are going to be talking about this in retrospect historically as this incredible aberration where there was no flu season. But it underscores the point of how effective masks are in blocking the spread of not just COVID, but other respiratory viruses. So I keep saying this, and I think it's important. If you're going to be in an indoor setting with a bunch of other people, wearing a mask is the best way to avoid getting sick, because what most people said during COVID, not only did they, avoid COVID if they were wearing masks, but they didn't get the flu, they weren't getting sick, they weren't getting regular colds because, we were wearing masks. That's what masks do.
So to that end, should we be bracing ourselves for a worse flu season this fall and winter?
Very possibly. It depends to a certain extent on what flu strains circulate, right? Because that's always the big variable. But here's the thing. Even if the flu is bad, there is a lot that you can do. Number one is get your flu shot when it becomes available, which is usually like October, November. So get your flu shot because that makes a big difference. But the other thing is, honestly, I think now we've realized in a way that we didn't before to wear a mask. Like prior to COVID, had you asked me, should you be wearing a mask during flu season? I would have said, well, it's not clear that there's much of a benefit. Now it's like, you know what? I think we've proven it to ourselves. The flu went away because everybody was wearing a mask. So if you do that in public settings, it's going to drastically cut down on your risk of getting sick.
As I hear you say that, though, I think to myself, we're telling people, here comes a new vaccine. It's more effective against the variants. Plus, there's going to be flu season. And I could see some people, being a little hesitant to say, wait a sec, I got to get a COVID vaccine and a flu vaccine. Wouldn't just the COVID be enough?
Well, no, because they're two different diseases. I mean, it's like telling me, do I have to get both a tetanus shot and a polio shot? I'm like, yeah, those are two different things. Getting the polio shot doesn't protect you against getting tetanus, right? So, I mean, you get a vaccine to prevent the diseases, right? I mean, why do you have to get one and then also get a monkeypox vaccine if you're at high risk for monkeypox? So they're different diseases. So every vaccine is directed against its specific illness, and so they're not. What's what I'm looking for. They're not interchangeable, right? It's every vaccine for things. So when there's a lot of COVID, you need a COVID vaccine. When there's a lot of polio going around, you need a polio vaccine. If you cut yourself, you need a tetanus shot. That's just the reality of how these things work.
Understood. I'm just wondering if people might look at the hesitancy of getting 2 shots for 2 different things, even though you need to. Although I think back to what you said earlier on, which is, last year you experienced for the first time ever no flu outbreak because people were in fact being more careful. Does that mean that this year, if people have let their guards down and maybe not everyone's wearing a mask and you're still going in public places, are you expecting the flu to come back? I mean, is there a chance that it won't?
I mean, I think we are going to see a rebound of the flu, and we already saw the beginning of that when, all the public health measures came to an end over the course of the year. So I think it's very reasonable to think there is going to be a rebound of the flu, and so that's why now that, everybody is more or less on their own in terms of their own health, unfortunately, do the things that make you safe, which is get the flu vaccine. And I would wear a mask in public. I have no qualms about that. I think it makes sense. I think the reality of that has been proven. It's just going to take a while for society to evolve to realize that that's an issue. And the other thing is improving indoor air quality. I mean, if you're going to go to an office building and work indoors with a bunch of other people, I think it's going to eventually behoove employers to make sure that there's good ventilation in the same way that now employers have to ensure that there's air conditioning, right? 30 years ago, the idea of having air conditioning at work was sort of a luxury. Now it's sort of standard. And I think air ventilation and air quality is going to follow the same basic process where eventually it becomes normal to have that in the same way that it's normal to have air conditioning at work.
Should be in our schools, too.
Yeah.
There is that. Dr. LABOS, thank you so much. Appreciate your time today, as always.
My pleasure. Take care.